Make a personal comment. This all began in 2016 when we announced the establishment of the Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies, the first, as David said, named center of its kind in the United States. That's a very big thing. Its brief was to engage students and faculty from Columbia and around the globe, and in teaching and research that would examine the region that is arguably unsurpassed in its impact on the world and in shaping modern society. Indeed, an understanding of the politics, history, culture, and religion of the Turkish people is essential to navigating many of the challenges we face in this century. The study of Turkey and its people have been part of Columbia's curriculum for decades, very important to note. We offer courses in Ottoman and modern Turkish, as well as courses in Turkish literature. More than 140 students from Turkey attend this university, one of the largest groups of Turkish students at any institution of higher education in the United States. And in 2011, we opened the Columbia Global Center in Istanbul, led by İpek Cem, whom I will introduce in just a second. Now, thanks to the Sabancı Center and the generosity of the Sabancı family, we stand ready to deepen our engagement with Turkey in all kinds of ways. The center's initial programming has focused on panel discussions and film screenings, including a book launch event for Orhan Pamuk, the Nobel laureate and Columbia faculty member. In the future, it will provide a focal point around which members of the Columbia community can delve into the history and language of the country, as well as contemporary politics and economics. Importantly, the center will also help us develop meaningful relationships with influential Turkish institutions, including other universities, NGOs, and think tanks, as part of a vital effort focused on intellectual and cultural exchange. Today, we celebrate the official opening of the center with a panel discussion on the timely topic of human rights and hybrid regimes. I really want to thank the Sabancı family for their ongoing generosity. We're honored to have Sakıp Sabancı's name on this center and on the chair for Turkish Studies here at Columbia. And I also want to thank Holger Klein, the interim director of the center, our panelists, our moderators, and the senior members of the Columbia administration who have turned out to recognize this important day. And the one thing I want to say is that we all know we live in a very troubled world. And of all the rays of hope that I can think of, it is this kind of institution, university, established families of great sort of tradition and culture, all working together for a common human purpose. I mean, that's a grand way to say that having this kind of relationship at this time just means the world to us, and we hope it does to you as well. So I'd like to introduce İpek Cem Taha as our next speaker. İpek is an entrepreneur, journalist, and founding director of our Global Center in Istanbul. She holds an MBA from the Columbia University Graduate School of Business and an MIA from the Columbia University Graduate School of International and Public Affairs. But more than anything, she is a dear, dear friend of us, me, my wife, Jean, and all of us here. İpek, thank you very much.
Thank you, Lee. It's an honor to be introduced by you in such a manner. Good morning to all of you who are present here today to commemorate this historic occasion, inaugurating the Sakıp Sabancı Center at Columbia University. It is certainly both a privilege and an honor for me to be addressing you this morning. Some of you will recall that since about 5 years ago, the establishment of a Turkish Studies chair and center at Columbia University was a dream we held closely. The relations between our countries are unique and important, and the benefits that can be reaped from such collaborations are important for the path forward. As an alumni, I reconnected with Columbia University in 2007 when I encountered the global vision of Columbia under the leadership of Lee Bollinger. This is also when I started to spend time with Professor Safwan Masri, who's now leading the global centers. 10 years later, there are now 9 global centers which connect further this great university to our world and its many issues. Many in this room know of the great legacy of Turkish businessman and philanthropist Sakıp Sabancı. We're privileged here to have Sevil Sabancı, the daughter of Sakıp Sabancı, who has initiated this gift with her family. A board member at Sabancı Holdings and Sabancı University, Sevil is also an international sportswoman and a significant contributor to arts and culture. Thank you, Sevil. The Sabancı family name for generations has been associated with business leadership in Turkey, but perhaps the most important legacies built by this name are also the great institutions dedicated to culture, education, development, and philanthropy, namely the Sabancı Foundation, the Sabancı Museum, and of course the Sabancı University. I had the great privilege to know the late Sakıp Sabancı, both as a dear family friend and also as a much loved and respected public figure. He always showed us the truth without embellishment, but at the same time with great empathy. He continues to light our path with his foresight about giving back. Without further ado now, I would like to give the floor to Güler Sabancı. Güler Hanım is a trailblazer, chairperson of Sabancı Holdings, and a public figure whose strength and foresight goes beyond the borders of Turkey. A woman for the 21st century who has inspired us with her dedication, hard work, and global vision. A champion of education in Turkey, not just as chair of the board of trustees at Sabancı University, but as someone who makes sure that there is consensus and collaboration on quality education, no matter what one's politics may be. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in warmly welcoming Güler Sabancı to the stage to share with us her thoughts and feelings on this day.
Good morning. Ambassador Sinirlioğlu, President Bollinger, President Zehra Sayer from Sabancı University. It's a great thank you, İpek, for your warm introduction. It is definitely a special day for us. It's a proud day for us. I would like to, of course, thank for all those for their contributions. I will start with Professor Bollinger's continued support for establishing the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies. I like to extend my thanks to members of the Executive Committee, Advisory Board, Ayşe Kadıoğlu, Holger Klein, and Alonda Nelson, and Ryan, the Columbia Global Center, İpek, and all others, and in particularly Safwan Masri and İpek Cemtaha, of course. Of course, I want to extend a special gratitude to Sakıp Sabancı family and his daughters Dilek Sabancı and Sevil Sabancı. Sevil Sabancı is here with us today, and as İpek also have mentioned, I have a special thanks for both İpek and Sevil, this young courageous women were the initiators of the thought that we are now establishing, which is, of course, as most of you know, Mr. Sabancı, and I understand the presence here of today expresses the global interest in the Turkish studies and also the interest in Mr. Sabancı's legacy. So I thank all of them, everybody who has contributed to where we have achieved right now. As for those of you who know Mr. Sabancı, and for those of you who don't know Mr. Sabancı, as Professor Bellinger have said, we're going through a interesting and difficult times in the world. It is nice to remember people and personalities like Mr. Sabancı. Mr. Sabancı has always thought about Turkey. His heart was in Turkey, but his thoughts were also in Turkey. But his thoughts on Turkey was never limited in the borders of Turkey. He had an international vision on every aspect. He was an outreacher. During his time, he underlined the significance of building bridges among cultures, among countries, cross disciplines, between ideas, between people. He was a strong supporter of collaborations, alliances, partnerships. He always believed that two is bigger than one. And so he was a reacher for relationships. And I'm sure he would be very pleased that when in his partnerships, in his collaborations, he would always advise us to do it with the best in class. So I think he would be very pleased that his name will be in Colombia, which is the best of its class. So we thank for all those in Columbia University for supporting such a center and the chair. As for the Sabancı University, I would like to say a few things because as Sakıp Sabancı was the honorary chair of the Sabancı University. In Sabancı University, we are proud to say that our university is the first in Turkey which allowed its students to choose and change majors until the end of the sophomore year. Also, in Sabancı University has pioneered in the admission. We are the only university in Turkey that made admission to the university rather than the specific departments. This brings Sabancı University to the forefront of the interdisciplinary research in its region. Sabancı University's as honorary chair, Sakıp Sabancı, has believed in social sciences deserved the same level of support as natural sciences. He strongly believed in this. And it was in his own will that he endowed Turkey's only academic award in social sciences with an international outreach. I'm very pleased that Professor Fuat Keyman is here with us today, who is leading the Sakıp Sabancı International Research Award process. The award has been given the last 13 years and has been given in subjects ranging from Turkey's economy to foreign policy, history, and social dynamics. Dear guests, Sakıp Sabancı's vision rests on four important pillars: excellence in research, global connectedness, inclusiveness, and impact. Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies aspires to situate the studies on Turkey in comparative global perspective. We hope that the Sabancı Chair and the center's activities will focus from understanding Turkey to how Turkey can inform and contribute to the global debates around the world. We believe knowledge generation, research, scientific thinking, and discussion will enable Turkey to become more effective and capable in finding solutions to its region and the global problems. Sabancı University in advisory capacity will be a partner towards the realization of this aim. It is, of course, it is the Columbia University who is the leader of this whole project. A global center with such an aim will inevitably touch many areas of inquiry. I hope arts, music, literature, business, history, politics, and many others. I'm sure that the center will lead to innovative cross-fertilization across the disciplines. In today's world, academia, business, and civil society, we increasingly see the need to respond to an increasing range of stakeholders. The center has responsibilities to the Columbia community, to New York, and will aspire to be an exemplary global citizen, I believe. I hear that during its inaugural year, our center has already hosted or otherwise sponsored several successful events. The interest shown to these events by the community has been very encouraging and reaffirms the destination Columbia University has set for the future of Turkish studies. As Sakıp Sabancı family, we are very proud to entrust the vision of late Sakıp Sabancı to Columbia University and believe that the center will be a crucial reference point for Turkish studies. We have full confidence that all of us in this room will contribute to the bright future. I thank you for all being here and joining our great day for us. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Holger Klein, and I am currently serving as the interim director of the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies here at Columbia University. It is my distinct pleasure to the second part of this morning's festive celebration, which is dedicated to a panel discussion on human rights and hybrid regimes, as you've already heard. However, before I introduce you to the co-moderators of our panel, let me express my deep gratitude and admiration to the members of the Sabancı family for providing Columbia University with the extraordinary gift, not only of an endowed professorship for Turkish studies, but also for the establishment of a center that will help to facilitate the dissemination of knowledge and the exchange of ideas between scholars and students engaged in various fields of Turkish studies, including those that focus on the history, language, religion, and culture of the peoples and empires that occupied the Anatolian Peninsula in historic and prehistoric times. It is a gift that will undoubtedly keep on giving for many years and decades to come. And what we have seen flourish in this first year of academic programming at the center gives us great hope for the future of Turkish studies, both within and outside of Columbia University and the city of New York. By situating Turkish studies in both a comparative and global context, it is our firm expectation that the Sakıp Sabancı Center will play a crucial role in supporting academic research projects, course offerings, and public events on and beyond Morningside campus, thus creating a strong and durable link not only between the faculty and students of Columbia and Sabancı University, but between American and Turkish scholars in a much broader and more comprehensive way. Our academic panel today, which consists of four distinguished scholars from four different academic institutions across the northeastern United States and Turkey, is a first attempt to build bridges between people and institutions of higher learning on this side of the Atlantic and beyond. The idea for a panel on human rights and hybrid regimes originated with Ayşe Kadıoğlu of Sabancı University, who is joined by my Columbia colleague, Professor John Huber, as a co-moderator of today's event. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to introduce them both to you this morning. Having received his undergraduate training at Lawrence University in Wisconsin, John Huber earned his MA and PhD in political science from the University of Rochester. He joined the Department of Political Science here at Columbia in 1998 after early appointments at Ohio State University and the University of Michigan. At Columbia, his research and teaching focuses on bureaucracy, civil war, and intergenerational solidarity, as well as on the comparative study of democratic processes. He served as the Political Science Department's Director of Graduate Studies from 2003 to 2006, and as chair twice, and everybody who was a chair of a department at this university knows how much work and dedication that needs, from 2006 to 2009 and 2010 to 2013. Last year, Professor Huber published Exclusion by Elections, Inequality, Ethnic Identity and Democracy with Cambridge University Press, a book that develops a theory about how inequality can foster identity politics, which can then limit the propensity of a democracy to respond to inequality. In addition to numerous articles, he previously co-authored Rationalizing Parliament, Legislative Institutions and Party Politics in France, as well as Deliberate Discretion, Institutional Foundations of Bureaucratic Autonomy, which won several prizes. John Huber's current research focuses primarily on ethnic politics, inequality, and the politics of redistribution. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2013 and has served as a member of the Executive Committee of the Sakıp Sabancı Center since its inception in 2016. Ayşe Kadıoğlu earned her PhD in political science from Boston University after completing a bachelor degree in political science at Middle East Technical University in Ankara and an MA in international relations at the University of Chicago. She joined Sabancı University as a professor of political science in 1998, following an earlier appointment at Bilkent University in Ankara and several postdoctoral appointments at Tufts, Stanford University, and elsewhere. Professor Kadıoğlu's fields of research are migration and citizenship studies, comparative nationalisms, and political ideologies in Turkey. She has worked on early 20th century liberal thinkers in Turkey, women and Islam, Turkish secularism, and issues of memory and democracy. At Sabancı University, Professor Kadıoğlu recently served as acting university president from 2016 to 18 and as dean of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences from 2013 to 17. She's currently a visiting scholar at Harvard University's Center for European Studies, where she has just completed a manuscript on free speech and academic freedom in Turkey, entitled Reading John Stuart Mill in Turkey in 2017. During her term as visiting scholar, she will pursue a comparative study of the changing nature of opposition in new authoritarian regimes, focusing specifically on actions of opposition political parties in Venezuela, Turkey, and Poland. Professor Kadıoğlu is the author and co-author of numerous articles and books, including Cumhuriyet, İradesi, Demokrasi, Muhakemesi, Türkiye'de Demokratik Acilim Arayışlarım, published in Istanbul in 1999, and Zaman Lekesi, likewise published in Istanbul in 2006. With Fuat Keyman, she published Symbiotic Antagonisms, Competing Nationalisms in Turkey in 2011. And with Kerem Ökten and Mehmet Karlı, she co-edited Another Empire, a decade of Turkey's foreign policy under the Justice and Development Party, and that was published in 2012. Please help me to welcome our two co-moderators and our four panelists to the podium.
Thank you, Holger, for the nice introduction. I wanted to start just by thanking the Sabancı family and the people at Columbia who helped make this center possible, and I'll say in a moment why I think it's such an exciting opportunity. But before I turn over the introduction of the topic of the panel and the panelists to Aisha, I wanted to make two observations that are really unrelated. The first is about what are sometimes called area centers, which is what people would call a Sabancı study for Turkish studies, a study of an area. And when I came into the discipline in the early 1990s as a political scientist in comparative politics, there was this sharp division between area specialists and comparativists, the people who focused on really understanding what was going on in a place, and people who focused on trying to draw general conclusions that transcend time and place. And that always seemed like an odd distinction to me, because I don't think you can do one without doing the other. And as an example, I want to pose the question, is what's going on in Turkey today something we would attribute to President Erdogan? And it seems obvious that he's done some things to contribute to the erosion of democracy in Turkey, but we can never really know if it would have happened anyway, because we don't have the relevant counterfactual, and we don't know if what's happening there is really attributable to broader social forces, because they're going on in other places in the world at the same time. And so to really understand what is going on in a place, you can't isolate that place from the broader study of the phenomenon you care about, such as the status of a democracy. And what's really been exciting to me as a member of the executive committee, and which was echoed in Holger's introductory remarks, is how much the Sabancı Center's initial center of gravity is to be a kind of area center of the kind that can really help us understand the place by situating it in the broader world in which it sits, rather than isolating it from that world and focusing strictly on what's going on in Turkey. And so I think today's panel is an example of that, and I hope we can continue on as we develop the Sabancı Center to keep this important point in mind. The second observation is that when we talk about hybrid regimes, we're really talking about democratic erosion, and we're concerned about that around the world right now. And when a friend of mine, unrelated to academia, said in 2016, what's the chances that Trump is going to get elected in the US, I laughed and I said, it's zero. There's no way. The guy's never going to get elected. And we know what happened, and I think that elitist perspective of mine is at risk. The next question I could ask is there really a problem of democratic erosion in the world right now? There's a few prominent examples, but social scientists are providing evidence that the number of democracies is up. There's good examples as well as bad ones, and the bad ones seem pretty prominent. And so my same response would be, don't worry about it. Democracy is the obvious thing to do. People are going to do it. We'll end up where we need to be. And when I think about my answer to the Trump question, I go, well, you probably shouldn't be so confident. We don't really understand how fragile democracy is, the conditions under which it can thrive, the conditions under which it's going to protect human rights, and we need the kind of analysis that our panelists are going to talk about today to make that happen. And so I'm very grateful to be a part of this panel and to the Sabancı family for making this possible. Aisha.
Let me also greet everyone for being here. It's great to be finally, having this moment. Thank you very much, the team at Columbia University. Sabancı University. As Holger said, I have been a professor of political science at Sabancı University for 20 years, but currently I'm on sabbatical leave at Harvard University Center for European Studies. And since January, I've been in Cambridge. And during the past couple of months in Cambridge, I must have attended at least 3 or 4 panels titled either How Democracies Die, or more hesitant titles like Is Democracy Dying? So the decline of democracies and the rise of new authoritarianisms, or what we refer as hybrid regimes in this panel, has indeed acquired an urgency in social sciences. The recently published books by Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, the title How Democracies Die, and another book, Ziblatt and Levitsky's book actually made it to the New York Times bestseller list. It's been there for months. Yascha Mung's book on People versus Democracy. So these are books that are being discussed a lot. They received a very wide attention. Now, at the top of the New York Times bestseller list this month is Madeleine Albright's book titled Fascism: A Warning. Now, I must say, Sabancı University organized Sabancı Brookings lectures for 10 years, from 2005 till 2015. And speakers like Brzezinski, Nicholas Burns were actually among the speakers. And Madeleine Albright was the first and the last speaker of the Sabancı Brookings lecture series. Hybrid regimes are distinguished by virtue of having multi-party elections, while at the same time displaying various authoritarian features. Concepts such as illiberal democracy, semi-democracy, electoral democracy, competitive authoritarianism, these are also used in the literature to refer to these regimes. They are, for instance, labeled post-communist hybrid regimes, as in the case of Russia, post-authoritarian hybrid regimes, as in the case of Tanzania, as well as post-democratic hybrid regimes, as in the case of Venezuela. Although earlier analysis evaluated such regimes within the third wave of democratization and basically expecting them to be in transition to democracy, by the early 2000s, a new approach that did not evaluate them within the transition paradigm emerged. And it is then rather important to make note of the stability and endurance of these regimes. Now, the new analysis geared towards understanding the peculiar features and dynamics of neo-authoritarian regimes are reminiscent of Hannah Arendt's characterization of totalitarian regimes in Germany and Soviet Union in the 1940s, when she used the expression novel forms of government. And when she argued that the Nazi regime in Germany and the Stalinist regime in Soviet Union were not any more or less authoritarian when compared to the authoritarian regimes that existed before them, both regimes were rather qualitatively different. This expression, novel forms of government, is actually a moment to start the discussion. Now, the genealogy of the academic literature on hybrid regimes can be traced back to the transitions debate. The 4-volume book published in the 1980s, Transitions from Authoritarian Rule. Although, of course, the new literature, as I said, does not refer to hybrid regimes as transitory phenomena, it still benefits from the many analyses of the transitions debate. Now, one of the most significant academic contributions to the debate on transitions was made by Adam Zworsky. And I would like to underline Zworsky's contributions in this very panel, inaugurating the Sakıp Sabancı Center at Columbia University. For Adam Zworsky received this year's International Sakıp Sabancı Award, the award that Güler Sabancı was alluding to earlier. The theme of the award in 2018 was Challenges to Democratic Governance and Living Together in Turkey and the World. So as you can see, there is a continuity between the award theme and today's inauguration panel. I would like to actually refer to Zworsky's work and start with that. And one of the most well-known expressions by Adam Zworsky appeared in his 1991 book titled Democracy and the Market, which is a book basically on Eastern Europe and Latin America. And in this book, Zworsky famously says, democracy is a system, he says, in which parties lose elections. And then there is a footnote he underlines, and he says, note that, he says, the presence of a party that wins election does not define a system as democratic. So he underlines the possibility of losing, clearly, the significance of the possibility for the incumbent governing parties to lose elections, or in other words, the existence of periodic winners and losers. With elections in sight in Turkey, I thought it would be appropriate to start the panel with this quote from Madam Zworsky. We will introduce each panelist as we, as they speak, and I will now turn to John to introduce our first speaker, David.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to introduce David Waldner, who is Associate Professor in the Woodrow Wilson Department of Politics at the University of Virginia. His first book, State Building and Late Development, explored the causes of different forms of state formation and the consequences of variations in state-building trajectories for economic development in Syria and Turkey. His two current book projects, both co-authored, are Why American Nation Building Fails, From Post-Civil War Reconstruction in the American South to Iraq, and After the Arab Spring, The Fates of Post-Authoritarian States and Regimes in Egypt, Iraq, Libya, and Tunisia. He has most recently co-authored an article with Ellen Lust titled Unwelcome Change, Coming to Terms with Democratic Backsliding, which will be published later this month in the Annual Review of Political Science. So, David, thank you for joining us.
Good morning. İyi günler. I would like to thank the organizers of this conference and the benefactors of this wonderful new center for inviting me to speak to you this morning. In their 2018 Index of Freedom Around the World, Freedom House downgraded Turkey from partly free to not free, reinforcing the concerns of many citizens and many scholars of Turkey that democracy there has been under assault under the governments of the AKP and, of course, its leader now, President Erdogan. On this inaugural event of the Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies, I would like to offer some remarks placing Turkish democracy and the threats it faces in a broader comparative context, highlighting both where Turkey overlaps with some emerging conventional wisdoms, but also where it departs from those wisdoms. In doing so, we can perhaps think about an agenda for this scholarly center that will both deepen our understanding of Turkish politics, but also help us to use the Turkish case to deepen our understanding of global democracy. First, it seems to me that the relevant concept for understanding most contemporary threats to democracy around the world is the concept of democratic backsliding, which entails an incremental deterioration of qualities of democratic governments in any of three areas. Backsliding makes elections less competitive without necessarily entirely undermining the electoral mechanism. It restricts participation without explicitly and totally abolishing norms of universal franchise seen as constitutive of contemporary democracy. And it loosens constraints of accountability by eroding norms of answerability and punishment, where answerability refers to the obligation of officials to publicize and justify their actions, and punishment refers to the capacity of either citizens or governing agencies to impose negative consequences for undesirable actions or violation of sanctioned procedures. Backsliding, as a contemporary phenomenon, thus differs from iconic moments of democratic breakdown via either military coup or the revolutionary seizure of power. Instead, the measures associated with backsliding are almost always the project of elected officials, of the winners of the electoral contest, as Aisha has just underscored. The project of the winners, usually in the executive branch, with or without the cooperation of the legislature and or the judiciary. These measures that erode the quality of democracy are frequently adopted using a legal facade, such as the referendum, and justified using the language of saving democracy from its enemies. A second point that follows from this definition of backsliding is that measuring democratic backsliding can be quite tricky, prone to both false positives and false negatives. After all, even in long-lasting and seemingly consolidated democracies, there are abundant opportunities for new regulations and strategic decision-making by politicians that can be viewed alternatively as either threats to democracy or simply part of the normal tussle of competitive democratic life. On the one hand, we're almost always forced to infer an executive's intent from the actions themselves, creating the vulnerability to circular reasoning. On the other hand, we're almost always forced to interpret each individual act in light of previous acts that might themselves have been misdiagnosed. There is plenty of room for error, and thus plenty of room for disagreement and legitimate debate about the extent of backsliding. Two thoughts to keep in mind after those sorts of debates. First, the electoral dominance of a single party over an extended period of time might reflect the intersection of the distribution of societal preferences with current electoral system features. Second, policies that are legally enacted and constitutionally sanctioned do not themselves indicate authoritarianism or creep in authoritarianism, no matter how intensely they are disliked or seen as illegitimate. A third point, and this will, I think, comport well with some of John's early comments, that backsliding is a project of elected executives often biases our analysis toward the actions of the executive, perhaps the executive's biography, the executive's ideology, etc., at the possible cost of ignoring other critical factors. It is quite clear that from even my superficial understanding of Erdogan, that he fits many criteria that scholars have suggested characterize autocratic demagogues who threaten democracy. But I would like to suggest that focusing too tightly on the individual personification of backsliding can be misleading. We might think more broadly about the existing set of institutional constraints or horizontal accountability, the degree of political polarization, which relates to vertical accountability, the structure of the opposition, and the nature of the coalition supporting the incumbent executive. And time permitting, I'll say a few things about each of these 4 points. First, institutions of horizontal accountability. The political scientist Stephen Fish has argued that backsliding stems from a pre-existing set of institutions that he calls super-presidentialism. The concentration of authority within the presidency with weak institutional constraints, such that virtually any strategic politician with any will to power will find it relatively costless and hence highly tempting to further concentrate authority. From this perspective, we simply do not need to know the biographical details and ideological commitments of the chief executive in question. Here, Turkey is a very interesting departure from the analysis. In 2002, Erdogan and the AKP came to power under a highly constraining and very much anti-democratic set of institutional constraints. To some extent, lifting those constraints should be seen as having pro-democratic consequences. The problem, of course, is both the actions required to lift the constraints were frequently illicit, and furthermore, there was no guarantee that having lifted these illegitimate and anti-democratic constraints, Erdogan was going to put into place anything new and more legitimate that would constrain his power. To some extent, then, Turkey's faulty democratic past continues to haunt it. Second, an observation about political polarization and vertical accountability. One might think that incremental assaults on democracy would eventually produce democratic electoral backlash. While given their initial preferences, members of the opposition would not switch votes to the incumbent based on backsliding measures, but one might like to believe that some members of the incumbent's electoral coalition might defect to the opposition based on their civic commitments to democratic procedures. But this, unfortunately, is not necessarily true. We might posit that the probability of defection is inversely related to the degree of political polarization, such that given very intense polarization, many members of the incumbent's coalition will either perceive these measures as legitimate or will calculate that they are acceptable cost to pay in light of the potential disaster of allowing the opposition to return to power. Third, the opposition. Backsliding is frequently preceded by the breakdown of the traditional party system, as voters withdraw their support from existing parties and therefore open the door for new contenders for power who had previously been excluded or marginalized by the normal workings of democratic politics. It seems to me that this is true for Turkey as well. But in discussions I have read of contemporary Turkish politics under the AKP, I have not seen enough extensive analysis of what happened to both parties of the center-right, ANAP and Doğru, and the center-left in the preceding decade. Without the collapse of parties in their electoral support of both parties of the center-left and the center-right, there would be no AKP ascendancy. Furthermore, the collapse, particularly of the right, is, I think, somewhat surprising. One of the keys to the resilience of Turkish democracy since 1950 had been the creation of an electorally dominant center-right coalition. And it is not necessarily the case that a center-right coalition will collapse under the strains of economic liberalization and structural adjustment, such as Turkey underwent in the 1980s and 1990s. Here, then, is an area that scholars of Turkish politics could usefully probe further and use their understanding to inform the subsequent phenomenon of backsliding. Finally, I am not convinced that we know enough about the nature of the center-right coalition put together by Erdogan and the AKP to support their incumbency. This, I think, is a crucial omission, for in the broader political science literature, we learn that the dynamics of putting together and sustaining a coalition are crucial ingredients to regime dynamics, including democratic breakdown or consolidation. In conclusion, then, a complete analysis of democratic breakdown will have to pay careful attention to issues of measurement, and will have to broaden its analytic focus beyond the biography and the ideology of the leading demagogue. Doing so will not only enrich the analysis, but may, and hopefully will, provide important clues both about how to reverse backsliding, but also how to ensure that any subsequent democratic regimes are themselves legitimately and durably democratic. Thank you.
I will introduce our second speaker, Lenore Martin. Lenore Martin is professor and chair of the Department of Political Science and International Studies at Emmanuel College in Boston, and an associate of both the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard University. She co-chairs the Middle East Seminar at Harvard. She has received 3 Fulbright Awards, the last one in 2010, as a senior Fulbright researcher at Middle East Technical University, working on Turkey and the Middle East. She has written a number of books and numerous articles analyzing national security in the Gulf, the larger Middle East, and Turkey, including the unstable Gulf, threats from within, in 1984, New Frontiers in Middle East Security, 1999 and 2001, and The Future of Turkish Foreign Policy, 2004. In 2010, as a member of the Boston Study Group on Middle East Peace, she co-authored Israel and Palestine, 2 States for 2 Peoples, If Not Now, When? An online book with the Foreign Policy Association. From 1999 to 2017, she co-chaired the seminar on Turkey in the Modern World at Harvard University. In 2012 and 2016, she spent the Trinity term at St. Antony's College, University of Oxford, as a senior associate member and visiting academic, respectively. Let me turn to Lena. I'll leave the floor to her. Thank you.
Thank you. First, I'd like to add my thanks to the Sabancı family and Columbia University for including me in the celebration of the opening of what I think will be a very promising Center for Turkish Studies. There could not be a better time to encourage scholarly work on Turkey and its interactions with the surrounding regions and with the international community. My short talk is actually, I'm going to use the PowerPoint just a bit, so I should, before I get going, get set. Okay. My short talk links foreign and domestic policy as an issue both for human and security in Turkey. I begin by looking at foreign policy as domestic policy through a comparison of Russia, the United States, and Turkey. I will then link Turkey's foreign policy to its domestic policy with the Kurdish issue as my central focus. Meliha Altunishik of Middle East Technical University and I began a project 2 years ago on foreign policy as domestic policy. My research for the project has focused so far on Russia and the United States under the presidency of Donald Trump. This has relevance for my talk today, as it is amazing how each of the leaders of Russia, Turkey, and the United States have used similar reference points in foreign policy to boost their policies and their popularity. For example, in 1999, Vladimir Putin promised to make Russia a great power once again. Under Putin, the Russian Orthodox Church regained its former prestige, and Russian history and empire became tools to build Russian pride, its place in the region, and the international arena, boosting Putin's popularity. Russia's aggressive actions in Georgia, Ukraine, and the annexation of Crimea all fell into this narrative as Putin introduced the idea of Russianness. With the annexation of Crimea, Putin's popularity jumped 16 points, from just under 64% to 80%. By March of 2015, his popularity jumped to 89% as he continued to criticize the West. Donald Trump used foreign policy to increase his popularity, beginning with his election campaign. It helped to consolidate his base of voters, some of whom were fearful of losing jobs and prestige and, their status. Thereby, he gathered the electoral votes of the Midwestern states in his favor, so that he could win the Electoral College, which he needed to, He needed those Midwestern states. So during his election campaign, he repeatedly referred to ridiculous trade deals that threatened American jobs, and that we needed to make America great again. After his election, he withdrew the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and he called the North Atlantic Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, the worst trade deal in history. When he pulled out of the Paris Climate Agreement, Trump said, "I was elected to represent the citizens of Pittsburgh, not Paris." President Erdogan has also used nationalist rhetoric and foreign policy decisions to boost domestic popularity. This developed over time. Recall that soon after his election as the governing, Recall that soon after its election as the governing party in November 2002, the AKP encouraged EU membership negotiations. The AKP thereby limited the role of the military and raised the hopes of liberals and Kurds for a more democratic Turkey. Later, the AKP began to refer to Turkey's Ottoman past to place Turkey as a leader in the Muslim world, based on its geographic and cultural heritage. Promoting Turkish nationalism has paid off for President Erdogan. For example, his popularity in Turkey and the Muslim world leaped to new heights following his one-minute Davos moment in 2009, when as Prime Minister, he criticized Israeli President Peres's defense of the Israeli invasion of Gaza, saying, "When it comes to killing, you know well how to kill." Erdogan's popularity in Turkey jumped by 19%, from 55% to 74% in just a few days after that statement. By 2010, Erdogan had become the most popular world leader in the Arab public opinion poll conducted by the University of Maryland and Zogby International. Erdogan Erdogan has increased his popularity within Turkey with nationalistic rhetoric and aggressive foreign policies, such as the current Turkish military interventions in Syria and Iraq, which had the approval of 90% of Turks polled in February of 2018. At the same time, the lack of resolution of Turkey's Kurdish issue has created a foreign policy Achilles heel for Turkey. Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and even Greece have been able to use the Kurdish issue to undermine Turkey's security. Turkey will remain vulnerable to the machinations of its neighbors and others as long as the conflict with the PKK continues. Erdogan's nationalist agenda has also negatively impacted the Republic's ability to resolve its internal Kurdish issue. Thus, in the run-up to the 2015 national elections, where Erdogan feared the liberal and pro-Kurdish HDP may make major gains in parliamentary seats at the expense of the AKP, he broke off the peace negotiations with the PKK. He also launched a major military campaign against the PKK in the southeast, as shown by Ersin Kılıçdaroğlu in his 2016 article, "Two Elections and a Political Regime in Crisis." The PKK terrorist attacks that ensued raised the sense of insecurity of citizens, leading them to vote for a strong government led by the AKP. And I want to take just a minute, so I'm not sure that you can see this particularly well back there, but what we have on your left-hand side is a poll that Ersin took in pre-June, the pre-June 7th, 2015 election. The concerns about terror and national security are 10th on the list there, okay? Just before the election in November 1st, you see terror and national security has now jumped to the top. And that was after the Islamic State attacks and the PKK attacks. So by starting that kind of issues, breaking off those negotiations, it ultimately helped the AKP's election. The renewed cycle of violence in the southeast and resulting loss of lives and devastation of property have led to increasing polarization between Turkish Kurds and other Turks. Today, with Turkey once more in the throes of an election campaign, the Kurdish issue, most especially in Syria and Iraq, is again front-page news. Once again, it provides Erdogan and the AKP government with the opportunity to promote nationalist sentiment. This is supported by the January 31st, 2018 report of the Kader Has Center for Turkish Studies, which shows that nationalist sentiment in 2017 had a negative backlash on the willingness of Turks to support a restoration of the peace process with the PKK that ended in 2015. As you can see, almost 58% of those polled were against restarting those talks. So this leads us to ask, if direct negotiations between the AKP government and representatives of the PKK are unlikely, how could Turkey be induced to resolve the Kurdish issue? Put another way, if track one diplomacy, i.e. direct talks, does not work, shouldn't we give track two diplomacy a chance? Track two diplomacy involves meetings of representatives of civil society and opinion makers with connections to the government or leaders on both sides of an intractable ethnic dispute. Typically, they meet in secret to formulate creative ways to bridge the distrust between both sides. Track 2 diplomacy has worked to lay the groundwork for the 1993 Oslo Accords that brought Palestinians and Israelis to the peace table, the 1998 Good Friday Agreement that ended the Northern Irish secessionist struggle, as well as the October 2011 agreement that ended the Basque secessionist struggle. The key to success of Track 2 diplomacy is enabling the civic leadership of antagonistic ethnic groups, meeting in what Professor Herbert Kelman, an early leader in this field, has called interactive workshops to, in Kelman's words, gain an understanding of others' concerns, expectations, and intentions. They can respond to others' needs in developing solutions to their own needs, because recognition of one's own needs does not require the negation of the others. This process is transformational and allows for creative sharing of ideas. Oops, I'm sorry. Okay. The results are transmuted into the largest civil societies of both groups and ultimately used by government representatives of Track 1 negotiations. Initiating Track 2 diplomacy in Turkey will, no doubt, not be an easy or simple matter, where the Erdogan government has cowed opinion makers with its suppression of dissent, jailing of journalists, academics, and HDP politicians, the potential candidates for Track 2 interlocutors. Nevertheless, as in the Israeli-Palestinian context, where interaction between the two sides was deemed actually treasonous, interactive workshops could still be conducted in confidence at undisclosed locations. If they do result in breaching the impasse of distrust between Turkish Kurds and other Turks, these workshops can devise creative ways to promote agreement on their significant differences. For Turkish Kurds, these are greater local political autonomy, economic policies to raise living standards in the southeast, removing restrictions on the use of the Kurdish language, especially in public schools, compromises on tax sharing with the national government, and finally, constitutional reforms. For the government and many of Turkey's citizens, it would at least require the end of PKK violence and disarmament. In sum, the ultimate conclusion of a successful resolution of Turkey's Kurdish issue will be a substantial increase in human rights for all Turkish citizens and a more secure Turkey at home and in the region. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Lenore. It's a pleasure to introduce Fuat Kamen, who's director of the Istanbul Policy Center and professor of international relations at Sabancı University. He works in the area of democratization, globalization, international relations, Turkey-EU relations, Turkish foreign policy, and civil society development. He is a member of the Science Academy in Turkey. He has worked as a member on the Council of Wise People as part of the peace process in Turkey. He has received numerous prestigious grants from the EU Framework Program and the Scientific and Technological Research Council of Turkey. Furthermore, Kamen has been the research director for various projects such as Peter Berger and Samuel Huntington's Mini Globalizations, Civicus, and Mapping Civil Society in Turkey. Kamen has conducted the first extensive research project and written on the political and social trends in Turkey, urban transformation, and living together in Anatolian cities. He's the author and editor of more than 20 books, including his most recent, Istanbul, Living with Difference in a Global City. He co-authored and co-edited books with the members on this panel, Democracy, Identity, and Foreign Policy in Turkey, with Sebnem Gümüşgü. and Symbiotic Antagonisms, Competing Nationalisms in Turkey with Ayşe Karaoğlu. Cayman has also authored numerous articles and published in prestigious journals such as Third World Quarterly, Journal of Balkan and Near Eastern Studies, Journal of Democracy, European Journal of Social Theory, Theory, Culture, and Society, and the Review of International Political Economy. So thank you, Fuat.
Thank you, John. I am very honored and delighted to be part of this panel, be part of today, when we launched the Columbia Center, Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies. And what I like to do today is to share with you my take on why is it that this democratic failure or democratic backsliding occurring all over the world, not only in Turkey, but in different countries. And as a matter of fact, as we said today, this center will not only deepen our understanding of Turkish politics, but hopefully to deepen our understanding of global politics and global democracy. And as a matter of fact, someone who's been working on Turkey for some time from the perspective of international relations and globalization, I think Turkey is also a laboratory of understanding not only the region in which it takes place, but also globalization in which it plays a key role as a pivotal state, regional power, and so on and so forth. And I will actually make a couple of telegraphic points to actually substantiate my take on why we are talking about and why we should be concerned about the future of democracy. And if you allow me, I will actually put together some names which we don't usually put together to actually explain my points. Karl Marx and Samuel Huntington. The first one. We don't actually use that, but I think we owe a lot to them. And first statement from Karl Marx that actually used in international relations, political science, historical sociology, so on and so forth, that he actually says actors make history, but not under the circumstances they subscribe to. And as a matter of fact, in order to explain why this concern of democracy is happening everywhere, I think we should talk about the structure in which this is happening, which is actually the very risky globalization, unprecedented challenges coming from globalization, from security, terror to economy, from inequality, about which we learn a lot, and I myself learned a lot from John, and to inequality, to climate change, so on and so forth. So Marx actually gives us a clue that we should actually, of course, focus on how these things happening in a national context. And a national context differ from another. Turkey is different from Poland, Poland different from Hungary, Russia, Argentina, Brazil, India, and everything. But there are also similar patterns. And then these similar patterns have to do with how these actually cases respond to global, unprecedented global challenges. There, I use the second name, Samuel Huntington. And Samuel Huntington's not recent work, which actually shapes all our understanding of the post-9/11 world, clash of civilizations. And as a matter of fact, I just read an article in Our Guardian where the author actually describes Trump's speech as kind of an echo of Huntington's clash of civilization. But what I like to share with you is not the second Huntington, but the first Huntington. Huntington of 1958, 1968, the soldier and the state, or change in developing societies, where he says that, unlike the economic modernization school, he suggests that for this kind of circumstances, order comes before democracy. Security comes before democracy. I think, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on what political position we are, maybe unfortunately, we are living in a global world in which the first Huntington is again shaping our understanding. That rather than democracy, we are focusing on security and economy. And as a matter of fact, this concern about security and economy, this prioritization of security and economy over democracy is not happening only at the level of the elites, but happening on the level of the society too. From Eurobarometer results to transatlantic surveys, to the surveys that we do in Turkey, indicates that people also prioritize security and economy over democracy. Even in advanced democracies, European democracies, that what I suggest is this. There is a disjuncture between security and economy on the one hand, democracy and human rights on the other hand. And as a matter of fact, the widening and deepening of this juncture is going on at the expense of democracy. So in this sense, globalization generates unprecedented challenges in which actors prioritize security and democracy, security and economy over democracy. In that case, we have actually also one name too, which is not as strong as Marx and Huntington, but there are a bunch of names there, like Putnam, like Englehart, that we also, while this is happening, observing a growing distrust in the existing institutions of representative democracy. People do not trust political parties. People do not trust the functioning of representative democratic institutions, so on and so forth. So rather than trust, which we like, what we face actually is a growing polarization in which trust in the existing institutions of representative democracy is declining, and possibility for some other actors to actually gain power and increase their popularity. Who are these actors? This is actually what we learned from Marx and Huntington and Putnam, is in the kind of a polarization, we are maybe entering in the age of leaders. And as a matter of fact, leadership becomes more and more important in political science, and leaders become more important than even their own political parties. Trump is different from his own political party, Republicans. Erdogan is different from and powerful than his own party, AK Party. Modi is different and more powerful than his own party. Orban, Putin, and all of the others actually are more different and powerful than their own parties. So in this sense, we are actually maybe in this kind of global environment, the disjuncture between security and economy and democracy, paving the way to the charismatic leaders to gain power and popularity and start shaping the terms of discourse and the boundaries of the political. And how do they do so and then gain actually a majority? I think they don't like checks and balances. They don't like neither horizontal checks and balances of power and the independence of judiciary, nor vertical checks and powers, decentralization and equal citizenship. Rather, they say that rather than checks and balances, in this kind of risky globalization, we need fast decision making. We gotta be fast, we gotta take decisions rather than deliberation, rather than representation. They kind of make a distinction between delivery based on fast decision and deliberation and rights and based on democracy and so on and so forth. So in this sense, this age of leadership, as for instance yesterday's Time magazine's cover, if you see it, the rise of strong men. These actually guys promise the people that they will deliver rather than they will actually protect rights, they will take care of their security and economy rather than democracy and the others. This is actually explains why we are facing this backsliding, decline, and concerns about democracy. Why should we be serious about concerning about the future of democracy? I think in addition to a separation between delivery and rights, between fast decision and right decision, on the basis of the polarized social or political network, they also damage two basic norms that will guarantee the survival of democracy. One norm is mutual toleration, meaning that the political actors approach us not as enemies, not as dangerous ones, but competitors. As a matter of fact, one of the strategies chosen by the leaders is to approach opponents as enemies, as traitors, as the guys who will actually damage the society. So in this sense, this mutual toleration, coupled with or in polarized, social setting, damage democracy. The second one is, we call it either restraint or respect for institution. I think there is a huge decline among these leaders. Different examples for the respect to the very norms on which our institutions of checks and balances work. Respect for constitution, respect for shared values, respect for fair and equal elections. Results become more important than procedures. Some kind of consequentialism shape the political science. So we have actually this problem. I think maybe we are entered in a stage in world system or globalization where we got to deal with this thing. Rather than political parties, leaders, rather than democracy, security, and economy. And our concern should be actually to balance security, economy, and democracy. And in that sense, I think there is a very important moment in which we have to go beyond the text, constitutions, rules and regulations, and we have to be doing something from below up. I think there is a responsibility for individuals, civil society organizations, think tanks, and centers like this, or maybe second-track diplomacies, to safeguard, to come up with guardrails for preserving democracy. I think in that sense, I hope this center, Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies, helps us to come up and strengthen guardrails for preserving democracy, not only to deepen it in Turkey, but also deepen our understanding and the possibility of preserving at regional and global level. Thank you very much.
Okay, I will introduce Şebnem Gümüşçü, who will be our last speaker in the panel. Şebnem Gümüşçü is assistant professor of political science at Middlebury College, Vermont, since 2014. In addition to the book that she co-authored with Professor Keman in 2014, titled Democracy, Identity and Foreign Policy in Turkey, she has published in prestigious venues such as Comparative Political Studies, Journal of Democracy, where all the discussions on hybrid regimes are actually taking place. That is a key journal. Government in Opposition, Third World Quarterly, and Middle Eastern Studies. She has co-authored highly quoted articles with her colleague Berk Esen, identifying Turkish regime as competitive authoritarian. Her research interests include political Islam, dominant parties, democratization and democratic erosion, Middle Eastern and North African politics. She's fluent in Arabic. She also studies Egypt and Tunisia in addition to Turkey, and doing comparative work, comparing the three cases. Şebnem Gümüşçü was a postdoctoral fellow and also a visiting faculty member at Sabancı University prior to joining Middlebury College as well. Welcome, Şebnem.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It is a great privilege to participate in the inaugural panel of Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies at Columbia University today. And I would like to thank both Sabancı family and Columbia University for establishing such an important hub of Turkish studies. And as this crowd shows, Turkey is always a very important center of attention. So this morning I would like to tackle the question of democratic backsliding and democratic breakdown in Turkey. And I would like to propose one key claim. That is, Turkey is no more a democracy. After years of democratic backsliding, it has now passed the threshold of democratic breakdown and is under a competitive authoritarian regime. So what is competitive authoritarianism? Competitive authoritarianism is a concept coined by Levitsky and Wei about a decade ago. It is a form of hybrid regime that stands in the space between democracies and autocracies. In these regimes, elections are still the primary means of attaining power, and the political playing field, however, is uneven. This uneven playing field between government and opposition makes political contestation unfair, while still maintaining the probability of regime change through electoral contestation. There are three defining features of competitive authoritarian regimes, and we can observe one or more of these features in a hybrid regime that we call competitive authoritarianism. Okay, that's fast. All right. First, civil liberties are systematically violated in competitive authoritarian rule. That is, freedom of information, expression, and assembly are systematically curtailed. Secondly, the playing field is uneven. The incumbent politicizes state institutions and uses its uneven access to state resources and media to tilt the playing field in its favor. And finally, elections are unfair. Major candidates are barred from running in elections, or significant formal or informal impediments prevent the opposition from campaigning on equal footing, or the electoral playing field is unequal due to uneven access to media, resources, or biased electoral authorities. At the time Levitsky and Wei published their seminal work, Turkey was indeed a democracy, so it was not part of their study. However, now Turkey does not meet the most basic criteria of democratic politics for a number of reasons. Although elections are still the most important source of political power for both incumbents and opposition parties in the country, the political playing field is no more even, civil rights are systematically violated, and elections are becoming increasingly unfair. This is why Turkey is no more a democracy. It does not meet the minimal definition of democratic rule, which is free, fair, and regular elections. So due to time constraints, I'm not going to talk about violation of civil liberties in greater detail. I'll just leave the floor to Freedom House that has been tracking freedom scores for many countries in the world, and this is for Turkey from 2003, the year that the AKP came to power, until 2017. And you can clearly see both political rights and civil liberties have deteriorated rapidly, not so rapidly, but particularly after 2011 in Turkey. Since we enter into a new election campaign, it may be more relevant to discuss fairness of elections today. More specifically, I would like to discuss uneven electoral playing field. Let me start with uneven access to media. For instance, in 2017 referendum, media access was restricted for almost all naysayers. On the 5 television stations which the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe monitored throughout the campaign period, the Yes campaign featured in 76% of airtime devoted to the campaign, as opposed to 23.5% for the No campaign. In the No camp, the HDP and the MHP naysayers were almost completely absent from mainstream media, while the CHP, main opposition party, with 19%, could find limited opportunities to appear on national networks. Not surprisingly, the stakeholders filed numerous complaints to the YSK, Higher Electoral Board, and RTÜK, Radio Television Supreme Board, but to no avail. For an executive decree dated February 9, 2017, had repealed the YSK's authority to sanction the media in order to ensure equal airtime for different parties over the course of the campaign. The limited airtime that the opposition had was mostly given by the Doğan Media Group at the time. Recently, the media holding changed hands. A pro-AKP businessman, Demirören, bought the company with cheap credit provided by a public bank. It is safe to expect much less airtime for the opposition in the upcoming campaign cycle. Now I would like to turn to uneven access to resources. The AKP government politicized public resources to skew the playing field against the opposition. In the electoral arena, this created an enormous advantage for the ruling party, which outspent its rivals, leading to unfair competition. The Oster observation reports on the 2014 presidential and 2015 general elections document that Erdogan's campaign appearances were often combined with official events to legitimize the use of public funds for their financing. In the 2017 referendum campaign, President Erdogan and Prime Minister Yildirim held large gatherings for official ceremonies financed by the state budget. Most of these gatherings turned into campaign rallies attended by public sector employees and students who are often required to attend. These public events allowed the ruling party to conduct political propaganda and gain visibility at taxpayers' expense, while the opposition leaders could only afford a limited travel budget from their own party funds. More importantly, both President Erdogan and Prime Minister Yildirim have access to discretionary funds, which are exempt from bureaucratic oversight. Indeed, in recent years, these leaders overspent these funds in the course of campaign periods, reflecting a broader trend under the AKP rule. One should also note that the fact that Erdogan violated the principle of presidential neutrality guaranteed in the constitution when he joined the AKP leaders in the campaign trail before the recent transition to executive presidency in 2017. While the AKP's access to state resources expanded, the public space available to the opposition started to shrink. For instance, during the referendum, naysayers from the MHP ranks were frequently denied permission to organize rallies in a number of cities by government officials, quoting security reasons. Several other impediments to CHP were also reported. Already uneven access to media and resources is further exacerbated by the state of emergency established soon after the failed coup attempt of July 2016. Both the referendum of last year and the upcoming presidential elections will be held under emergency rule, which effectively lifts constitutional safeguards for civil liberties like freedom of expression, information, and assembly. For instance, last year, more than 100 activists from political parties and associations were detained over the course of the referendum cycle for security reasons. Several individuals hanging posters or banners opposing the presidential system were given fines for vandalism. Furthermore, naysayers were physically attacked during campaigning by pro-government vigilantes, especially in AKP-dominated areas. Finally, the governor of Ankara banned all protests in January 2017, shutting the public space in the capital city of the country to citizens until the referendum. Also recently, we started to observe more irregularities in the voting process. Electoral authorities now reveal somewhat a clear bias in favor of the incumbents. On the day of the referendum, the YSK last year made last-minute changes in the vote counting procedures and accepted all unstamped ballots as valid upon the AKP's request. This decision rendered the entire process vulnerable to fraud by lifting a critical safeguard and was in clear violation of the stipulations of electoral law. Regardless of its impact on the outcome, the YSK's decision to validate unstamped ballots undermined the credibility of the process and trust in the electoral institutions and the rule of law. That said, one should not actually underestimate the support, popular support given to the ruling party. So it is not possible to claim that some 50% of the votes, or around 50% of the votes, are actually coming from this uneven competition between the incumbents and the opposition. So I agree with David that we need to kind of look at coalitional politics more closely and ask the question, why do people keep voting for the AKP, given the fact that the party has been undermining democratic politics? And that's a very important puzzle. Although I do not have a lot of time to talk about it here, with my co-author Berkesen, we have just finished writing a manuscript about this, and we're looking at one particular factor, political economy. So not Erdogan's personal traits and features as an autocrat, and not their ideology as political Islam, but we're much more interested in political economy, and particularly the coalition, cross-class coalition that the party has built over the years. And two important pillars of that coalition actually is composed of businesses and the urban poor. So we argue in that piece that there is a triangular dependency that the party established between pro-AKP and loyal businesses and the urban poor. And you can see that over the last 15 years, the AKP successfully created a dependent coalition, which means through social assistance, distribution of social assistance to the urban poor, and distribution of favors, bids, and public procurement and favorable taxation practices, the AKP has now rests on a very strong cross-class coalition. And that is where we should actually look at if we are to understand how the AKP can still afford this significant violations of democratic practices, but also enjoying substantial support from the people. Given all this, there is no reason to think that the upcoming elections, presidential elections in June 24th, would be fairer than 2015 elections or 2017 referendum. The news we received from the campaign trail indeed indicate that the opposition is now facing a steeper uphill battle than ever. Thank you very much for your attention.
We'd now like to open the panel to questions from the audience. We will take maybe 2 or 3 at a time. I think we'll try first without a microphone, so we ask that you recognize that there's people behind you and in front of you, and that you speak loudly. So thank you, sir.
Yeah, my name's Norman Reservoir from London. Obviously Turkey is a special problem, so is England, and Brexit is a special problem, China is a special problem, Russia is a special problem. I think I've got quite a loud voice. But the big issue is not democracy, in my opinion. It's much more, and I think that you guys have not addressed, is why the liberal elite, which is represented, of course, by every single person in this room, is beginning very seriously to fail round the world. And that, I think, is, if you like, the problem that I think you should address, rather than the failure of the word democracy. I think democracy is not failing. It is what I call liberal values are failing. And of course, I'm a liberal myself, and I hate Brexit, for example, and I hate what is going on in Turkey in many, many ways. What I do not quite understand, and where you guys who are political theorists need to address, is why the liberal elite, as it were the ruling liberal class elite, is clearly beginning to fail in different ways, but as it were consistently round the world. Thank you.
Yes. Excuse me, up front, please.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to express my deepest congratulations for the establishment of the Sakıp Sabancı Center. In fact, Sakıp Bey was a visionary person. And he wasn't only the industrialist, very pioneer in Turkey, but at the same time, people have always thought that he was one of them. I think that was very important. For the panelists, more or less, I have the same questions with the previous speaker from the floor. We are very good, in fact, identifying the reasons. Of course, the decline of democracy, or let's say, that we are all concerned what's happening all over the world, these challenges to democracy. It is not valid only or limited to one country. Even in mature democracies, we have the same concerns. But the question is, of course, the rising inequality could be one explanation, or the polarization within the countries, of course, there is another. But also, in general, people are, let's say, punishing mainstream, or let's say, the representative of the liberal democracies. And what could be the answer, response? What we are expecting? There are some serious discussions, even not only this rise of populist rhetoric, whether the other side should adopt the populist rhetoric to address this issue, or what should be the answer? How we can, let's say, overcome this rising populism all over the world? Thank you very much.
We'll take a third question, yes.
Actually, the previous question inspired me. By the way, Abdullah Tansel from the City University of New York. And I clearly see the liberal values are failing. And I'd like to hear from the panel what happened the liberals in Turkey, how they shaped the improvement or the decline or the demise of the democracy in the past 15 years. I'd like to hear your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have three related questions about the demise of liberal values or the failure of the liberal elites, some possible explanations for why it happens, and a really important question is what do you do about it, panelists?
I'm just going to, this isn't, I'm going to bring up an op-ed that was in the New York Times about a week or a week and a half ago, and I'm embarrassed because I don't remember the author. That's not good for an academic, but I thought the idea was very, very important, and it goes along with the last panelist. And that was, and it brings up the issue of human rights, because what that op-ed was talking about was just the problem that all these three questions have been addressing. And the author suggested that we remember that that human rights also includes economic rights. And that we have to rethink that, and we, as the liberal elite, if you want to call it that, we have to take that and address those issues. And I think if we look at some of the turmoil, the migration in the world today, it points to that issue. But it also, when I think of Turkey, if I can go back just to that one, because we are really talking about, the center will certainly be including so much about Turkey, that I think in Turkey, it also included more than economics. Certainly economics and the differential is important, but I think in Turkey there were also social issues that were very important, and that the AKP addressed those issues early on. And I'll just go to something that I haven't said in a long time, but I used to. You know, when I went to Turkey in the mid-'90s, the late '90s, there were all those Gezi condos. Remember? You get off, you leave the airport, both in Ankara and in Istanbul, but certainly in Ankara, huge areas of Gezi condos. You don't see them anymore, and that's AKP. You know, so there were certain issues that the AKP addressed that no one else addressed. And I always say to my colleagues and friends, when they ask me, why does AKP, why did they do so well for so long? I think part of that is that there are people that AKP answered to that the other parties weren't answering to. And I think that begins to give us something of a response to these very important questions.
You know, there's three questions that are related to one another. There is one actually academic answer that we've been discussing this. Why liberal values are failing, why liberal actors are, losing power. When we look at from representative democracy point of view, we used 10 years ago, we start talking about the crisis of representative democracy, the crisis of center-right and center-left parties in Europe and all over the world, and the crisis of those parties in attracting members. And so there was a big decline in the membership, in the support, and so on and so forth. And we actually start talking about, for instance, in Europe, the rise of the extreme right and right parties, or Islamophobia, xenophobia, and those things. We try to solve this problem through participatory democracy by including civil society in it, or by deliberative democracy. But right now, none of them worked, and these actually leaders took the advantage of it and gain power. I think why is it that? Then I come back to my globalization reference, and in globalization too, we have actually heydays of globalization. Then we had big crises. Then the very big one is 2001, 9/11, 2008 global economic crisis. We try to solve these crises by, sort of fixing the side effects of globalization, global governance and everything. But right now, even the reformers of globalization, from Stiglitz to Kemal Dervish, the others, they are much more radical, because inequality, as you pointed out, is a very, very big problem. In Europe, I heard from Stiglitz suggesting that a cow in Europe is better than 47% of the world population, because there is $2 subsidiary to a cow, whereas 47% of the world live under $2. So there is a huge inequality, huge exclusion, huge inequity problems, which liberal values cannot, sort of really respond. Either we're going to come back and deal with it, or we're going to leave this huge space to, these actually strong leaders, strong men that promise those people that they're going to fix it through delivery, through this, but forget about democracy for a while kind of thing. And even one of my actually references, Michael Sandel, he's a liberal guy, Harvard University guy, but he wrote actually a book, Can Money Buy Everything? There's a huge concern about the decline of civicness, even in the United States, because parents, as we are better than our kids. But the situation is supposed to be other way around, that our kids are better than us kind of. So in this sense, this whole, hugely risky, challenging globalization in terms of inequality, in terms of inclusion, exclusion, in terms of Daesh to ISIL, all these actually the terror activities. I think liberal values and liberal leaders are facing difficult time to respond to that. You've got to be more radical, and as a matter of fact, even our universities, our students, expect us to be more radical than we are, because if we are kind of going for center, then they say that wouldn't cut it, because we live in a time where you got to be more stronger, and so in this sense, unfortunately, we live in a globalizing world in which risk, uncertainty, and ambiguity are forcing the leaders to actually go for more populist, more delivery, more actually kind of things than liberation. But this is not today's thing. And if academically speaking, we will actually, if you study it, it was coming. The checks and balances were depreciating, globalization was not governed, still everybody went for profit over, things, and now we actually have a situation where we don't know where we are going. But liberal values, liberal actors, liberals in Turkey or anywhere are really actually facing difficult time to respond to it in a convincing way.
This point about the failure of liberal elites and liberal values, and it's not really about democracy at all, seems to have aroused, as I watch people's heads nodding, seems to have aroused a lot of affirmative support. I noticed my interlocutor did not stay for the answers. A sacred principle of deliberative democracy is ask a question and then leave.
That's 2 out of the 3.
So this is a scholarly center. So let's be scholars for a moment. Let's not just be citizens. Let's not just be people who read the newspaper. Let's not just be people who get angry about things in the world. Let's be scholars. As scholars, point number 1, show me the data. Show me the data that liberal values are really on decline around the world. I know there are some names out there who are rising to prominence based in part on being at a school outside of Boston, claim that liberal values are in decline. I think the evidence for that is really quite weak, and it's not what I would call top-rate scholarship. But look, take the United States for a moment. Are liberal values in decline in the United States? In my lifetime, African Americans did not have the right to vote in large parts of America. Now they do. In my lifetime, people were denied basic civil liberties based upon their sexual orientation. That is no longer the case. If you want to tell me that liberal values are in decline in places like America because some huckster schmuck got lucky, and that's all it is. That's all it is. He got lucky. Jim Comey doesn't write that letter. He's probably back begging NBC to put him on, semi-prime time. Don't derive from the conclusion that bothers you so much some belief that you know what the cause was. Second, listening to you, it's as if you think we're living in some despotic age. Have we forgotten the collapses of democracies in interwar Europe and all the chaos that followed from that? Have we forgotten World War II and the Holocaust? I mean, compared to that, the fact that someone like Erdogan has to take years and years and years to undermine, say, a military that has too much power to begin with, to undermine constitutional courts that have too much power to begin with, and so on. Yes, he has gone too far. Yes, it may be a competitive authoritarian regime, but to look at that and say, this is an example of the failure of democracy and the failure of liberal elites, I don't think so. It is a sense that we've been able to constrain demagogues today in ways we were not able to constrain them in the past. Third, what do? There are two things you can do, two broad categories. One, you change the incentives of existing leaders. Or two, you mobilize for direct action and you get rid of them. That's it. Those are your two categories. Figure out how you want to work within those two categories and move on. Thank you.
As a co-moderator, I also wanted to add something. It was Ferit Zekeriya who used the expression illiberal democracy, end of 1990s, coming from Huntington's tradition of institutionalism. Illiberal democracy. But lately, there's also the expression that is undemocratic liberalism that's being used. So it's either illiberal, democracy or undemocratic liberalism. This is actually, Yasha Mounk uses this expression, undemocratic liberalism, Yasha Mounk at Harvard, who just published the book People versus Democracy. So this is actually, there is an internal paradox of liberalism. It's very difficult to be liberal and democratic at the same time. It is usually skewed in, one or the other. So you actually do have, illiberal democracies and undemocratic liberalisms also. I just, because since I've been studying opposition political parties, in Venezuela, Poland, Turkey, it was Thomas Piketty who made this remark. He talks about the Brahmin left, and with Brahmin left, he refers to the relationship between opposition political parties and the elite. And in a way, what he's saying is opposition political parties in most of these countries where you see, authoritarian tendencies or authoritarianism, sheer authoritarianism, opposition parties have actually become the parties of the intellectuals. They have lost touch with the people. They have become the Brahmin left, elite left. Left has acquired elite dimensions, and it has lost its touch with the people. And therein comes, these other political parties that actually make the connection with the people. So there is a vacuum created by the left political parties who have connected more with the elite than they do with the people, actually. So I just wanted to add that as a remark also.
Sure. Sentences. When you look at the surveys coming from the Middle East and North Africa, for example, you hear that people have very different conceptions of democracy. When they ask what do you think democracy is, there are two main answers coming out of those surveys. First, people define democracy, rights and liberties, and the right to vote, and so on and so forth, the usual definition. And then there's also another definition that comes quite strongly, and that is economic well-being. So not everyone believes that democracy is about liberties, civil liberties and rights, and political rights. So I think if liberal elite has failed, they failed when they stopped thinking about how social and economic rights are critical for democratic well-being and democratic politics, and for liberalism for that matter as well. So I think the traditional definition of democracy is something that middle and upper classes can afford. We want liberties, we want civil rights, we want political rights, because we do not really worry too much about our economic well-being. And when people are really deeply concerned about their incomes, the fact that they don't have enough money to feed their families and their kids, then they really do not care a lot about civil liberties and freedoms. What they really care about is their income and what they make.
From a slightly different perspective, which is whether we are actually seeing a moment where democracy is doing its job in a way that we want it to, that if there is this situation where the liberal elite have lost touch and the voters cleaned them out, as happened, I think, in the US, that makes the liberal elite rethink, and it creates a new kind of party competition. You see what's going on within grassroots left in the US right now in democracy. I think some of the same things are going on in Britain. And so I think it's wrong to think about places like the US and Britain in the same breath as you do Turkey, because what hasn't happened in the US and Britain has been the erosion of rights and the use of repression by the government. And so if the response is going to come from below, people have to have those opportunities. They can't get together in Gezi Park and end up in jail and have the government clamp down on them all the more. And so for places like Turkey, I think the solution has to be, it's much more difficult to have it come from the bottom up. It has to come from somewhere else, either outside of the country or within the country. So I think an interesting question related to yours is, once repression takes hold, how do you start to reverse it in a place that's tasted democracy? The other point, echoing a little bit about what David said about how bad is it now, is if your point of reference is 10 or 15 years ago, things look kind of bad. But if your point of reference is 25 years ago, just a little bit before, things look really good in the world right now. And what happened after the decline of the Soviet Union was a lot of democracies taking hold in places where democracy was really difficult to operate. We had this big surge, and a lot of those you wouldn't expect to do well. And so the fact that they're not isn't reassuring in any sense, but it's also not very surprising. It takes a certain set of conditions. And so I was never that democratic, and the fact that it's struggling reflects some of the challenges that exist there with democracy, and the same is true in some of the Eastern European countries that have a very short history with democracy. And so the more troubling ones for me are if we start thinking about what's going on. Not troubling, it's not more troubling, but the more surprising ones are in places that have had a longer history with democracy, and there I think that the hope, to answer your question, is from below. And what puzzles me is in places where repression has taken hold, where do we find it? And I don't think that we know. I'd like to thank all of the panelists for the very different contributions and the helpful contributions, and to everyone here for coming. Thank you.
So if you bear with me for a few minutes, I will not stand between you and the reception below, but I would like to say thanks. I would like to say thanks to a lot of people who have worked behind the scenes. I would like to say thanks to our hosts here at the Italian Academy, David Friedberg, the director, and Rick Whittaker. I would like to say thanks to our wonderful team at the Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies, François Carrel-Billard and Sharon Kim. I would like to say thanks to, thank you. I would like to say thanks to the President's Office, the Office of Global Centers, the Office of Development, and the Columbia Communications Office, who all have made this event possible. Last but not least, I would like to thank everybody on the panel for a wonderful discussion, and we are taking your thoughts and your advice and criticisms with us. I hope that the Center for Turkish Studies, the Sakıp Sabancı Center for Turkish Studies, will be a mechanism and a motor to have more discussions like this about Turkey, about the region, about the world. And now I would like to invite you to all go downstairs to a reception to help us celebrate the inauguration of this wonderful contribution that the Sabancı family has given us. Thank you.
Thank you.